I wanted to make this recording. It's going to be in the car. I sort of dealt with this issue rather embarrassingly in a recording called the Synopsis or something like that, where I got into something like the legal history of the misapplication of the Constitution and the willful misinterpretation of the Constitution and the insertion of collective racialist justice or collective racialism or something like that, which is pretty much another technical way of referencing this demonic force of identity politics, which has taken hold of culture and politics in a large way, whose morality cannot be cracked. We have to recognize that a lot of the source of this is government's policy itself, which has pretended to be directed from the Constitution, but it is actually a betrayal of it. And so this has been going on for quite some time. So if you look at the Equality Clause and Section 2 of the Equality Clause, I'm not going to quote it, but I know it well enough from memory. I'm probably going to get the wording slightly wrong, but if you actually look at it and you read it and you match that up against with what I'm saying, you will see very clearly the point that I'm making is obvious. And so basically Section 2 of the Equality Clause says that Section 1 does not stop government essentially from making policy that essentially promotes the interests of achieving equality through making programs that will aid persons or categories. It actually uses the word categories of groups of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination in the past. Okay, now how disadvantaged is used there is therefore very clearly a present tense adjective that belongs to the category of persons or person that has been unfairly discriminated against in the past. Now, when you say that, when you create this catch-all phrase of groups previously disadvantaged, then the group just has to be previously disadvantaged, which puts the disadvantage in the past. And it doesn't point at the disadvantage in the present that would be qualified essentially by creating a justifiable category. So government never made categories of people previously unfairly discriminated against. They never made these categories. They just said, are you a group previously disadvantaged? And this is the definition of that group. And so because government essentially never created a qualified category that essentially would have been justified in terms of an open liberal democratic society based on non-sexism and non-racialism, they have failed in enacting Section 2 of the Equality Clause, and in their obtuse treatment of it, they have essentially smuggled in this conduit for corruption, because so many people can claim benefits through being part of a group that was previously disadvantaged. So essentially something like the doctrine of collective racialist justice, and then obviously then it follows that people who believe in collective racialist justice, like the disgusting fascistic type of politics, then want the correlating inverse of that also active in law. They want collective racialist punishment. It only follows. And so this has been the root of the moral corruption in the New South Africa. This has been the nexus of the moral degeneration that we have in our politics and our society. And obviously this is promulgated by academics who are happy to have this oversimplified, unprincipled way of essentially replacing morality and ethics and principles of ethics with essentially image-based substitution of integrity, with just these images which people can sort of be leadership can sort of use them as clever symbols, essentially, that they can get around any issue. They can always make themselves righteous because the image itself is just so pliable to being projected and imposed onto whatever problem arises, whatever complaint occurs, whatever counterclaim is made. It doesn't matter. The image, essentially, when you compare it with it, you can always just create the new bridge that would lead to that image. And so, you know, when you've got that image instead of reason and principle, you know, essentially you don't have an open, liberal, democratic society anymore. You've just got fascistic demagoguery and people talking on behalf of identity and comparing the pride of those identities as a way, and then just pointing to stupid words in the Constitution, essentially, that have become stupid, and say, well, that's what dignity means, is that our collective racialist entity needs an equal pride, and the image of that essentially is enough to move things along, even to undermine and destroy the Constitution. And it did happen first with the ANC in their misapplication of subsection 2 of the Equality Clause. Okay, now, yeah, so that is it in a nutshell. You know, this could probably have, you know, in a proper society or something like this, you know, we would have had a judicial system that would have picked up on this, that would have rooted this out, that this stuff would have been challenged. You know, it all would have been thrown out, and qualifications that were justifiable, you know, because in a sense, then there's no balancing force to sort of constrain the unwieldy use of this, of what essentially becomes an infinite loophole, essentially, that government can use to cover up any corruption, essentially under the guise of their misapplication of subsection 2 of the Equality Clause. And that, in some sense, is the you know, that is the destabilization of the South African South African institutions in a nutshell. You know, there's a video that I didn't, there's a recording that I didn't upload that deals with kind of like an image of the ENTP psyche from the, it's kind of like an imagination of how they relate to the world, and how essentially they use their ideals, their images of sort of morality, to sort of just make a whole slew of complaints and points and, you know, contentions. And essentially it is the environment's job, essentially, to try to cater to all of these things and make them consistent, even when they aren't consistent, even when they don't have a way of coherently coalescing into a government policy or into a program or something like that. That sort of all these contradictory feelings and assertions, somehow they're all important parts of the ingredients that all have to be collectively served. And, you know, that's what you can get away with a kind of image-driven morality, instead of building it up through principles and then recognizing that actually what you want, or what you think is moral or something like that, it actually just, it's insoluble, perhaps. You know, and so because the thing that is safeguarded primarily is this sense of, well, I'm looking at it above everything else, you know, I'm this kind of like, I'm looking at it from from 1,000 miles in the sky, looking down at everything, and that kind of pristine sense of sort of judging everything from this armchair, and seeing only the groups on the ground, and seeing only these factions, and sort of what would plug into, a kind of a generalized reading and survey about what people seem to be like, so already it's locked into thinking about the world in terms of a calculus that is very this is the problem, is that generalizations are by their nature fundamentally untrue on the individual level. They work only in statistical sense. There's an old saying, lies in statistics. It's you stop being able to see the wood from the trees. And so when you want to administer something on behalf of the statistic, you end up dehumanizing everything. You end up taking away the interpersonal dimension in life. You end up taking away the thread of people's integrity. You don't see dignity anymore. You can only see group pride, essentially, becomes your reading of integrity. And these are the kinds of thinkers. This is the kind of thinking that, even though some people don't naturally think like this, when they give regard to people who do, who sort of control the structural way of framing things, or becomes the root of our common perception, essentially the state starts living inside the ideological prism of an ENTP, essentially. And I do think that, even though a lot of proponents of identity politics aren't necessarily ENTPs themselves, I do think that there is a case to be made that, in some sense, it is like putting society, incepting it into a matrix in which essentially we're all bits and pieces of an ENTP's ideology, where essentially that's what people end up kind of ideating themselves into being. And if everyone just gets into that same program, if everyone sort of just if there's a kind of universal buy into that, there's this idea that somehow people will actually be able to derive at that interpretation of social justice, that there's a resolution to seeing the problem through that matrix, and essentially there isn't, because unless there's a further external, unless there's a further essentially, this is why it needs a scapegoat, because generally what ENTPs do is they just do this against whatever is in their field, with whatever is in their environment. It just the tension is shifted into the exterior, into the external. So they've got this string of complaints and contentions, and somebody else has to kind of like pick each of them up as if they're sort of parts of this of a greater wisdom. And if you just sort of string all the beads together, and then you do the work that sort of that each bead represents, that there is something to be done that would holistically do something for all of that, and it's just not true. It's a false promise, and so all they essentially do is they keep on sort of thinking, oh yes, well, we're just so righteous because if someone just collected all these pearls of wisdom and strung them together and then sort of lived up to it, then that would be the solution. And it's that kind of idealism, essentially, which has an inability to kind of question itself, to compare itself against a kind of an alternative schema, to imagine that there's something else. It's too in love with its image morality, with its image conscious morality. It's too hypnotized by it that it won't let itself go. And so essentially the image is so alluring that it won't drop it for a real understanding of issues. It won't let the image be displaced. you know, and so it's essentially transfixed, you know, and you will only screen for things that agree with it. You'll have itching ears only for essentially confirmation bias. And, you know, essentially, I mean, I've often just described this kind of behavior as a kind of either it feels like you're being trolled, because it's just this constant onslaught of attrition, and because, you know, they will derail, they will interrupt, they will talk over, they will straw man, you know, they'll put words in your mouth, they will tailor their own memory, they will have a very selective memory, they'll have a very cherry-picked screening of what is being said, because it just, whatever makes the image true, you know, and so they just keep on sort of table thumping the image. And I mean, it's quite funny, because you will often hear people that will literally, something has just been discussed, and this discussion will move on, and then perhaps it'll move back to that point, and you will ask them perhaps to tell you what you know, like how they see the issue or something like that, or how they see the issue has just been argued, that issue, and they will misreport. They will literally revise their memory in real time. It's literally delusional, and essentially that is how strong the image morality has a purchase over them. It's they are so immediately transfixed by it, you know, and you can see this happening in the mob consciousness. You can see this occurring, and so I do really think that the ENTPs, they might not be necessarily the very tip top of the leadership, but I think they're always around the leadership, and they are always essentially the field marshals. They are the journalists. They are the you know, they're essentially they're the ideologues. And they are capable of getting their hands dirty in a bit of dishonesty to make the ideology function more pristinely, to make it function more simply. You know, so I mean, a lot of the Nazi propaganda apparatus knew that it was creating a false reduction of reality, but it was morally justifiable because their morality is based on an image consciousness, is based on a collective racialist justice. And we have the same thing that comes out of, well, that essentially was bought into, because, you know, it's just too easy, it's too convenient to pass up on. But this is the moral corrosion that it sets in. You know, and I think, you know, this is partly why I think we can't get a handle on anything in this country, because principles are very important. People don't realize the far-reaching, nuanced consequences of having a hollowed out husk of essentially, of, at least, I'm not saying, because I've argued myself that government is never meant to be the arbiter of moral authority, but it is meant to be congruent with some kind of higher moral authority, which in our instance, in our politic, is the Constitution. And because that has essentially been, what's the word? It has been relented, or it has been maligned. It has been maligned by this kind of politic, and by this kind of legal, I mean, a legal system that promotes and allows this kind of collective racialist justice or image-based, also that's another point. But the image-based morality essentially is what gives rise to the practice of legal positivism. We have to see these things as completely correlating. This is why generally Napoleonic legal systems have this built into their structure. This is why they have such poor, the kinds of rights that they have, and the kind of legal structure that they have, the kind of avenue of address that the individual has against the collective essentially is, it's not civilized. I mean, we have to be thankful that essentially the structure in South Africa, at least in some abstract jurisprudence sense, exists, even if it's not, we don't have the legal minds that have been able to sort of keep it clean from this pollution. This monstrous specter from history that has essentially re-emerged itself. And you can see it in the action of the state that invested into this stuff. Anyway, now I'm just repeating myself. I'm just going to stop the recording. This is just going to be a small addendum. So basically, one of the points that I was trying to make, one of the important points, is the lack of there being any scope of attenuating the overstepping of the government or policy in terms of using this symbols or sort of gestures at the image morality, which essentially has no way to it has to be adopted wholesale, because you either accept the image or you don't. It doesn't have principles that is capable of kind of self-constraining itself in any way. So it has this sort of built-in doubling down inflation, which is just wonderful for any dictatorial system or a kind of demagoguery, which sort of it just continues to conceal its own corruption endlessly, because it has no sort of legal mechanism that essentially can actually force it to substantiate itself and such, and justify its policy. And this is essentially all the failing or the nefarious interpretation of government of subsection 2 of the Equality Clause in the Constitution, is to essentially promote the ideological corruption. Now, this is somewhat a side note or whatever, but just as a kind of historical sort of cultural commentary on this. Let me just think of how to introduce this. I mean, when I talk about gender politics, I'm not interested in identity politics myself. I say this essentially as hopefully a tool to deconstruct some of the very toxic things that are around. But essentially, I mean, I'm by no means making the claim that there is more narcissism among women than there is among men. But in terms of a kind of toxic femininity that has essentially that latches onto this kind of ideological image consciousness. The reason why it generally takes on the role of women doing this essentially is because there are double standards in culture. Narcissism as a masculine trait is culturally suppressed, whereas at the moment narcissism as a female trait or feminine trait is somewhat celebrated as the means of tackling the structural oppression, which is essentially the model of the image morality instead of a morality based on principle. I mean, obviously, I'm just pointing this out not as a way to solve how would you solve the problem? You can't treat categories of people, or you can't treat whole groups of people. You can perhaps aim messages at categories within that group or something like that. And, as a point of advocacy, but to sort of lump in everyone into a kind of collective guilt. Oh, you're a woman, so you're responsible for this. That's not true. I mean, it's patently not true. Not everyone falls into the same sort of, not everyone falls into the same behavior, just because you can generally associate something with a movement. I mean, although I generally would say that in the modern feminist camp, there is nothing of substance. I mean, like what is... there aren't feminist issues. Equality is a, is an individual concern about individuals. Making it about identity and having moral consideration for the identity rather than the individual is how we got into messes, and it's not the solution to them. But yeah, I do think that there is a cultural symmetry between the so-called morality in feminism and the kind of the collective justice model of morality, which is essentially proto-fascism. You know, it has the same values as fascism. It has the same philosophical structure. You know, Hitler would have called these people useful idiots. You know, these are the type of people that were hand in hand with the Nazis when they were bringing down and destabilizing the functioning of the liberal democracy in Weimar Germany, what were called the dissatisfaction marches, because they were dissatisfied that justice was not being delivered to their identity, and they just needed the right demagogue and the right representation for identities to mediate out justice between all identity. And that, you know, sort of the hope is that all the layers in identity, all the different identity layers, the multiple layers, could all be addressed in turn, or sort of have a kind of mediative brokering done on top of them, which obviously is a lie. Because the process is so unprincipled that the only way to make ground is essentially by finding a scapegoat to malign, or cutting, you know, making convenient ideological reductions so that the framework, the ideological framework, stays sound and true, even as you have to kind of tailor and mythologize history and, you know, sort of make the right adjustments to reality, essentially, and to what is polite and what is allowed to be considered and what is allowed to be looked at. And essentially the challenge gets transformed into something that the ideology is appropriate to, and so you can't actually look at the real problem, because it's not a generic problem, it becomes a special problem of identity. And essentially people don't have dignity and integrity at that level, they just have group pride, and they need to be made separate but equal, or some disgusting, crazy notion like that, which has that easy symbolic image reference that demagogues can sort of bank on, and they will bank on it. You know, and essentially everything in society gets translated into that currency, and, you know, you're left with essentially narcissistic marshals, field marshals, using this very fragile morality, and, you know, you've got a runaway society essentially there's no way of bringing it back down to reality, and they'll just keep themselves suspended in their sort of ideological delusion on the corpses of their enemies, on the corpses of everyone who would challenge them in their righteousness, in their self-righteousness. Because they don't they will only engage in debate when they control the chair, when they control the specious moral framework that gets to regulate the debate. They can't share the chairmanship, they can't negotiate it out, they can't actually persuade. They can't be convincing, because there's too much insulation built into their argumentation. So I also wanted to go on further in expanding on the that when you have an image-based morality,
it creates this very toxic sense of orthodoxy and dogma that is sort of that leads to censorship and a kind of a mob structure and a mob mentality that sort of governs discourse, essentially by accusations of contravening the supposed principle that the image represents, because it becomes a wholesale image. And the problem with the image is also that it can never come about. Like, how can you ever prove that the image has actually been realized? The image of separate but equal. You have to bring out statistical sheets. And so the only way to socially engineer that is by the worst kind of concentration of power and ad hoc administration of people that essentially hollows out any kind of merit-based functional liberal society in which people can actually use their own sensibility about things rationally. Instead, they're forced to adopt a kind of institutionalized prejudice in order to make the image realized. And there's only that way of, because although it's weird, but if you actually do the principle-based approach, you actually somewhat get there in the end, and you get to a common understanding. And you forge a unified nation that has an ethical system that actually, sort of works at every level, and, sort of everything reinforces itself, the integrity of the system, and a sense of a common pursuit towards a shared vision. But that all breaks down when you've got this very rigid image that is impossible to correspond to reality except by force, essentially, and by a kind of perverse, institutionalized groupthink. I saw a video on YouTube between, or it was titled something like the DA whip and DA leadership, arguing with the chair of the Speaker of Parliament. And, it was, in my standard, it's very hard to sort of critique these things, but I would have just suggested that it could have gone better. The dignity of the principle could have been made it could have been stressed and emphasized more. Sort of basic questions. Mr. Speaker, how is it confusing? How is a different political opinion, or how is a political opinion that is differing from your own confusing? To sort of emphasize that, what is the source of this confusion? How is this statement contravening the Constitution? So sort of putting it out in a question form, to restate the point. I mean, it's correct enough to call it rubbish. Or, even to sort of make honest invitations that, I'm prepared to withdraw my statement if you would withdraw the ruling, the unreasonable ruling, the biased ruling, the vague and embarrassing container of a political prejudice. Sorry, I was thinking about this before making this recording, and I'm not. It just shows how hard it is, and it's easy to sort of go with the simpler thing, but to try and show, to try and emphasize the principle that is being contravened, rather than the disagreement, rather than pressing the disagreement, sort of brings a greater dignity to the, I mean, obviously, so also, I mean, you could also weave in that, if you're not capable of revising a ruling that is tantamount to political favor and political partisanship, a political partisan ruling. If someone is unable to do that, then they are unfit to be the Speaker of the House, to act in that role. I mean, the only political opinion that the Speaker is essentially allowed to censor in some sense is one that contravenes the Constitution. And inasmuch as the rules of Parliament must be commensurate with the highest law of the land, if you're not unable to sort of to make the chain reason and substantiation of what in the Constitution is getting confused. The only, I mean, to try to police the coherence of a political argument, I mean, the only political argument that needs to sort of be interrogated by the Speaker is one that contravenes the Constitution. That's it. This is, the Speaker is aiding the House by promoting the orthodoxy of political opinion that is his own, and removing obstacles that differ to that opinion. That is rubbish. But again, the cashing out the principle and making that the sticking point. It is very hard to confront these things like that and to sort of stress the principle when it's just so obvious, it's so blatant. I think having some understanding of the way that the moral calculus is different when you have this idea about a collective racialized justice, when you have a collectivist racial justice, if that is your image of integrity, of ethical principle, if that is the basis of your morality, then this is what happens, is when something is confusing that opinion, when something is destabilizing that very fragile ideological system. It's the same thing when the UCT students came together in some activism thing that to promote that no, we must be allowed a group identity, that the group identity must be respected and must be, basically fascist politics, fascist ethics, fascist philosophy, that society and structures and systems must be amenable to that level of interrogation and that level of moral accountability to that group identity. And obviously when society is expected to serve group identity and justice given to group identity, then it's the individual is it's incompatible. And sorry, I should have put this out sooner because this was in my own thinking before I made the recording, but the word that needs to start being used is intolerance. And to cash out the contravention of principle that is the to illustrate the claim about intolerance. So you make a claim about intolerance and you substantiate it in terms of the principle, which means that you have to have a working functional model of how the principle is supposed to work in principle. You have to have a correct principle where you can see it working in real time, that you can sort of conjure it in real time, that you can impart an understanding of it. And then you show essentially how someone is invidiously corrupting that, and you can speculate and even insinuate as to why they might be doing so, but that isn't the importance. You don't have to prove that. You just have to prove the breakdown of the principle, and that is intolerance. It doesn't matter why, in some sense. You can posit that as a kind of afterthought. You can say that, well, then it obviously seems to be so, that the speaker cannot contain his political partisanship, and that he cannot put down his partisan politics to fulfill the role, making him unfit. This would have probably come out better if I had remembered the introduction of how I would, if I was the member of any party, I would say, I would like to bring a point of order on behalf of my allegiance to opposition politics. To speak on behalf of the whip, who did use rude language that was correct enough, although by my account imperfect. I would go on to invite the speaker to withdraw his unreasonable ruling. As he has not been able to substantiate how this is a confusion to any right in the Constitution. The matter that he finds confusing is that the political opinion being expressed differs to his own, and his inability to tolerate, or his willingness to be or to express intolerance on behalf of his own political opinion, which has no correlation to his constitutional function, leads him to be unfit. If he cannot withdraw his ruling, if he cannot think on his contention that he has raised, if he cannot not absorb the complaints that have been made against his ruling. It flowed a lot better, and I think there were more points of articulation that I'm sorry. But I just wanted to say that when I was going on about feminism earlier, I really am only bringing that up as a historical kind of, this has been the vector that this level of poisonous thinking has now obviously it doesn't just include the feminist movement, although it did come from the philosophy around feminism, which was essentially rehashed Nazi philosophy, basically. The Nazis did consider themselves social justice warriors, essentially. That's how they saw themselves. Justice for the identity according to the structural, cultural things. Now, as I critique this sort of ideological treatment and reduction of life, essentially I just want the rule of law. I just want the equality clause in the Constitution to be properly adhered to and put into law. That's all I want. I don't want any structural overcompensations to be done to dunk on this ideology. I just don't want it in the legal system because it is a poison. It is a toxin. It is incommensurate with the Constitution. It is a betrayal of the Constitution. And, just basically the point is the main point about feminism, which is just a historical description, which doesn't impute anything evil onto women themselves at all, but just but as a generalized point, we can sort of and again, this does not attach to individual women, but this is just something to understand how we got to where we are. We still have to solve the problem in the present, not how we got here, but the general cultural taboo against the accountability of women, the moral accountability of women, and essentially feminism, that still is pretty much the symbol of the entrenchment of feminine narcissism. You know, I mean, obviously, men and women can be both narcissistic and probably in equal amounts, but generally speaking, masculine narcissism is suppressed culturally, whereas feminine narcissism is somewhat celebrated as part of the solution, as kind of the vanguard. You know, this is the kind of radical vanguard corruption that somehow, if you can complain about a problem, then your solution can be just as nefarious as the problem, that it will reach an equilibrium, tit for tat sort of stuff, which essentially you can only do when you have an image-based morality instead of a one based on universal principles. And this must be seen also in context in how the misapplication and the invidious interpretation and effect is given to subsection 2 of the Equality Clause. I would say that is how it's sort of leaked into, well, at least on the legal side. Obviously on the cultural side, so in terms of the legal history, that's how it happened. And in terms of the cultural side, I'm just giving these two explanations to see how these things were pushing each other. But they are the same evil ideology. They are the same resuscitation of Nazi philosophy.